it is actually the individual who can really make a difference in this area, or the individual working with groups of people with the right set of skills that can create openings that can be a very important part of the preparatory work. I've actually worked in conflict resolution in the Middle East for the last 2 decades. And what the Oxford process is about is preventive diplomacy. What can you do quietly behind the scenes to ripen the conditions for peacemaking? And in that, and part of it, is mediation skills. But why it's been such a pleasure to work with CEDR is that you have very deep skills in, you say commercial mediation, but a lot of it in many ways can be applied to the international geopolitical landscape, because things like how to get into the mind of the other, how to understand the big picture, to put together the geopolitics and the human mind, and then use all the mediation skills is entirely relevant to the resolution of conflict. Some of the big peace processes, Northern Ireland started with the economics. South Africa, it was a business organisation that actually started the back channels that led to the official negotiations. Certainly, working in business can be a very interesting place to start, possibly a less threatening, less challenging than actually going direct head-to-head in terms of the conflict. And we found that when we did the training last time, that we had people who came with business skills, and there was a lot of discussion about where could certain openings potentially be sort of nurtured and developed. And in fact, peacemaking demands the most huge amount of preparation, sometimes years, and it's actually what happens quietly behind the scenes, the kind of back channels that are not always, often not official government initiatives, but much more quiet preparation, because people who've been in conflict are seldom in the right mindset to make peace. And I think business has a huge interest in resolving conflict, because the consequences of conflict is very harmful to business. And often business also has good relationships with government, or has networks or access, or can build these relationships. So certainly that's a very important area. People might think that peacemaking only happens at the UN or in sort of large formal institutions. But I think the area that people know less about is what goes on quietly behind the scenes, and the kind of preparatory work that can be done to ripen and ready better improve the conditions for peacemaking. And this is often acts of this often happens in unexpected settings. So the role of business can be very important here, or even people with legal backgrounds, or people with psychological understanding, and people with particular understanding of conflicts, perhaps, that have meaning to them. And it is actually the individual who can really make a difference in this area, or the individual working with groups of people with the right set of skills that can create openings that can be a very important part of the preparatory work. It's certainly a world where doors open and they slam with great rapidity sometimes, and we have to remember that we're working with very, very deep conflict. I mean, we did some work on the proxy wars in Syria. We also did a lot of preparatory work on the Iranian nuclear deal, which is in a sorry state now, but at the time was very important work about how to ripen the conditions. And in fact, the previous negotiators approached us to help if we together they could prepare what a deal would look like. I've historically done a lot of work on the Palestine-Israel conflict. I'm not sure we can say there's too much resolution there, but nevertheless, it has been about how do you prepare the parties so that they are in a greater state of readiness? And within that, there are moments where that's possible, and then there's a bigger, some of the politics that's sometimes bigger than us. Currently, I'm working on something in Europe, and there's plenty of tension points and conflict there at the moment. You see this sort of regression of human behaviour. Before there's violence, the potential for compromise is much greater. Once it's turned to war, people are actually often more interested in retribution, and the capacity to compromise is severely reduced. Hence the importance of everything you can do quietly behind the scenes in advance of things tipping to war. Yeah, I suppose what we're trying to do is amplify their learning to the sort of the bigger world stage, and to think more about the geopolitics. So you have to have that big picture. When there's conflict, there are always interests, and who are the different parties involved, and there are usually proxy wars. And so you have to kind of map all the different areas of conflict and understand it. And then also then begin to think about where are the points of influence, leverage, where can you start, what's your route in, because you can't necessarily access the power brokers to begin with. And a lot of the work is about building relationships, building networks to be able to access points of entry. And then one of the things we've developed over the years is getting groups of people together to help them prepare, often from quite an emotional mindset, to trying to help encourage people to think more strategically, more about the end game and what's in their self-interest. One of the theories we've developed is we talk about managing radical disagreements, because people in conflict, you can't sit people down and think they'll immediately find common interests. Often they're not in the mindset to resolve conflict. So there's often a lot of preparation work that needs to be done, and certainly that's part of the training, thinking about that. We've got a wonderful potpourri of trainers who are involved. I mean, CEDR brings all its experience and skills in training people in mediation, not least listening skills and empathy skills and getting into the mind of the other. And then also understanding kind of when you have to be firm in your boundaries, and when you have to push to move things on. And then ourselves, I mean, I bring this my experience of 20 years of having worked in conflict resolution in the Middle East, and my colleague Nita brings wonderful mediation skills from having worked in the UN and in the Commonwealth, and having set up the mediation unit at the UN.